Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kim Schmidt, Executive Editor of Farm Equipment. Welcome to our latest webinar in conjunction with the Western Equipment Dealers Association. Today's presenter is Eric Wareham, Vice President of Government Affairs for WEDA. He plays a major role in expanding and enhancing WEDA's state advocacy network by working with legislators, governors, and their staffs on legislative activities that impact WEDA and their dealer members. His public policy expertise and political experience is coupled with extensive state policy experience in both trade association and the private sector. Before he gets started with the presentation, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. On your screen, there's a control panel with the Q&A icon. You can submit questions here at any time, and then time permitting, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible following the presentation. And then just like always, we'll be recording the webinar and we'll share it with everyone who's registered in the event you want to go back and watch it later. All right, we're ready to get started. Thanks again for joining us, and you can take it away, Eric.
Thanks, Kim. Welcome everybody to this presentation today. We got plenty to discuss here in 2022 off to the new year. The things we're going to go over, we're going to start with some state budgets just to review sort of where we're at across the country when it comes to projections and revenues and some tax changes that are occurring. Then we're going to skip on to some federal priorities, talk about the budget there, some of the infrastructure bill discussion, and then things specific to agriculture. And of course, the old penny right to repair. We can't get through a presentation without talking about that. I'm sure most of you are here to get an update. So we're going to start with a look back at where we've been to get to today and then where we are now. And then I want to share with you guys survey results from a campaign that WEDA is working on called Repair Done Right. We'll kind of start wrapping up with a little bit of primer on redistricting, where we're at with that, and then finish up with midterm elections, which are right around the corner, believe it or not. So to kick us off, I wanted to begin our discussion with a state of state budgets, and we've had a lot going on in the last couple of years with COVID that certainly has affected state budgets, and we can see that, for instance, in 2020 on this graph, that you had a general fund shortfall. 35 states ended up with a general fund shortfall from their projections from 2019, which makes sense because we had some extraordinary growth over the past few years, and then COVID kind of put a stop to that. What we did see, though, is that a lot of states responded pretty quickly, whether that was emergency session or otherwise, in cutting back. And a lot of states cut back, and surprise, surprise, when you cut spending and the revenues kind of keep rolling in steady or even more, as it turns out, then you had in 2021 47 states that outperformed their budget projections. And looking ahead to 2022 to now, we're kind of in the same boat. There's no states really underperforming. 10 are on target with their budgets, and 32 are higher as of right now. Some states have yet to pass their budget. So what this just reflects is that we kind of had this, V-shaped recovery from COVID, and states did not get impacted as much as we expected at first. And there's a couple reasons for that. And if you look at this graph, what we see is the trend line for annual general fund spending changes from 1990 to 2022. And, in that middle there, just this kind of follows, I guess, what would track on the economy overall. But we had, a big rise in 2006, 2007, and then, of course, the big crash in state budgets. Right now, if you look at that, we didn't have as much of that pronounced V-shape type of recovery as we did in 2009, 10, 11. We actually didn't dip that much as far as state spending went because they curtailed spending, and it's shooting back up to levels that we've seen since. And so that graph really shows the percentage change year over year. And so we're on track in 2022 to have one of the highest percentage growths in annual budgets across states across the country. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is obviously the stimulus money in the economy. lots of people continue to spend. There's a lot of free money, interest rates are low, and the like. Another factor is personal income collection remains stable. What we saw is that, higher income earners were somewhat insulated from the sort of COVID crash. We had the lower income, which is unfortunate. And I think it's one of those unintended consequences people didn't realize, is that all of the lockdowns and shutdowns and regulations on business, and it really affected the lower income earners in our society who don't contribute much to that personal income collection anyways. And so, high income earners maintained their salaries and stayed working. And so, personal income collection at state levels, income tax was not drastically affected. Another one is that states are reporting online sales tax collections are way up. And this relates to, if you'll remember back a couple of years, the Wayfair decision, where states had to establish thresholds for remote sellers selling into their state. So Amazon or whomever was getting away for a long time without paying tax into states that they sold into. And when all those, 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, the Wayfair decision came down, all the states started to pass their own statutes that required sales tax collection from remote sellers. And so our dealers also had to comply with that. And we kind of went through that phase. And so what we're seeing now is that states are collecting that online sales tax. And that is bolstering state revenue funds as well. And then finally, the curtailed services from all those lockdowns and everything we experienced, those were really services that didn't affect sales tax as much in most states, that are based not on services as much, but on sale of goods. And so we're seeing that continue even with the inflation. There were numbers out this week that sort of, I don't know, the opposite of what we would think is people are out there spending money still, even with inflation being high. It's counterintuitive that people are out there still buying more, but consumer spending is up a couple percentage points. And maybe it's because they're buying it now because they think their money's not going to go as far in another year. But regardless, state budgets are on the rise. And so what does that mean for tax changes? This is kind of an interesting graph here. And I highlighted the sort of key points in it, which are the number of states enacting decreases. And so we have right now 15 states that have enacted sales tax decreases. Another 24, almost half the states, are enacting personal income tax decreases and corporate tax rates. There's 16 states reducing corporate tax rates. And so what's that amounting to is not as large a number as we'll talk about in a little bit on the federal level with their spending in the trillions, but still pretty significant that it's a net change of minus $2.9 billion, almost $3 billion going back into people's pockets. And so that's also generating even more. So we've had this kind of growth and then money still going back to people's pockets, and so continuing that growth. So that's a really, if you're one of the unfortunate souls to live in a state that one of the 5 states that increased personal income tax during this, that's too bad for you, I suppose. That may be some of those states that are losing population, like California and New York, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into redistricting later on. So another driving force for states' revenue collection, and one of the reasons that their spending is going up, which, by the way, I didn't throw up the graph, and maybe I should have, but you may think, at least with the tax reductions, that states are being somewhat responsible when their coffers are full. They're kicking back money to their citizens. Another thing that they're doing, though, is investing back in their rainy day accounts. And so each state, as a percentage of their total revenues, rainy day accounts across the U.S. are up higher than they've ever been. So states are, surprisingly, being somewhat responsible with the influx of money that they have. And one of those huge influxes of money, the largest, is the American Rescue Plan Act. And legislators have started to use the jargon ARPA and ARPA funds. And what we're seeing there, and this is this blotch of color over here that looks somewhat like a Venn diagram, is sort of representing the states with the largest amount of money going to the smallest. And so California is receiving the most from ARPA funds. Texas, as you would expect, because it's somewhat based on population and also unemployment figures. But we have $195 billion going to the states from the federal government, another 65 to the counties, and 45 billion to municipalities. And so states are spending this, and it's a use it or lose it scenario. The funds actually have to be allocated by 2024 and then spent by 2026. And if you talk to a lot of legislators, you know, this is separate, and we'll get into it later, but this is separate money from the infrastructure bill. But a lot of the funds are being used on infrastructure because there's a wide array of uses allowed under ARPA. It can be public health or even revenue backfill of states. And this is when, you know, when this bill was passed by Congress, there was this idea that states were going to, you know, lose all their money. And we saw that in that first chart, that a lot of states did underperform on their revenue. So Congress allocated this money to them to possibly backfill their revenues if they were short. It also could be used for water and sewer projects and even broadband. And so wide latitude given to the states on how they chose to use it. But nonetheless, it kind of somewhat went to a general fund. And so states already started to have all of this money before even the infrastructure bill. The difference is that use it or lose it, that they have to spend it by 2026, is putting a lot of legislatures into a pickle, and they're kind of, quite frankly, wasting a lot of money because they have projects that have to get done by 2026. The money has to be spent, and they, you know, I've heard that what it's doing is also creating inflation because they're projects that would have cost, let's say, 50 million, they're paying 60 million just to get it done in time to use that money towards it. So that's a big driver as well. We're jumping over to the federal priorities. You know, this is kind of tied in. The first big news, and this isn't really news to anybody who's been paying attention at all, is that Build Back Better is dead. And Kim and I were talking about this prior to jumping on the webinar, just how huge of a deal this was. And it felt at times like Build Back Better, with all of its tax provisions, was going to be somewhat like a Section 179 scenario that we had years ago, where Congress wouldn't pass or re-up it until, you know, 2 weeks before the end of the year, and everybody had to go make all these transactions very quickly. And it felt like that might be the case, but in reality, what we have now is, especially now that we're heading into the midterms, the election year, everything else that Congress needs to get done. And Manchin's position on this is that Build Back Better is dead, despite President Biden still tweeting about it. So what are they working on? What's Congress up to? They're transitioning to the budget. And Congress will be passing a continuing resolution through March 11th. The House already passed that, and the Senate is on its way to do so. That will give them some breathing room to work on an omnibus bill that really is a true funding bill. And the framework for that has been agreed to by the chairs of the appropriation committees in both the House and the Senate already. So that looks like it's actually moving forward. As for 2023, by this time of year, we're working on the budget for the next year. Biden has held back their budget proposal until after March 1st, when he gives the State of the Union address. And there's reasons why that budget is so important, and why I mentioned it is because the infrastructure bill, that $1.2 trillion bill that had $550 billion above baseline spending, with large amounts going to infrastructure, there are big chunks of that bill that people don't realize are dependent on Congress passing a 2022 budget bill that builds into it spending, some of the other additional spending for those roads and those bridges. So right now, there's actually a lot of projects and states are kind of on hold or waiting with bated breath to some extent for a federal budget to be passed so that they can get rolling on these projects. And as you guys know, the infrastructure bill, lots of things in it. You could spend an entire webinar just on that. For our purposes, I think one of the, hard infrastructure, obviously railroads, when we're talking about supply chain issues, moving goods, which we'll get into here in a second, with the ports, that is so critical for us and our customers. And then of course, there's the $65 billion in rural broadband. And, the broadband initiative, there's, every state is receiving an initial $100 million with the remaining $42.5 billion based on the percentage of unserved locations. And so, regardless of whether you're California or you're Wyoming, you're going to get that 100 million up front, but then the rest is based on how, need. And so I think what we're going to see is in farm country, when you talk about Kansas and Oklahoma and even Texas having upwards of 60% unserved land in their states, they're going to get a sizable chunk. And, I was just in Idaho on a different issue, but was talking to them about how they're receiving somewhere around 500 million, $500 million for rural broadband. And those states, they're going to have to come up with 5-year plans to have a grant process, because most of the money is going to be through a grant process. And so, that is going on right now, which is great news. I'll get into this a little bit later with our right to repair discussion about how critical that rural broadband piece is. On other federal priorities, agriculture specific, this is a win. The news isn't covering this much because it doesn't fit the narrative of everyone, hating each other and being pitted, fighting to the death against one another. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act is in response to an issue that has arisen, and many of you may have already heard about this, that there's Chinese exporters who are paying premiums to ship their containers back empty. So they're coming to our ports and they're, pass and go, not collecting $200, and they get a return back to China in an expedited fashion because the ports are so backed up that if they have to wait to get loaded, it takes that much more time to get back. So they're paying a premium to basically just turn those containers right back onto the ship and head back to China. What that's doing is having a huge effect in the bottleneck that we have at the ports currently, and it's exacerbating that problem. And it's estimated that $1.5 billion has been lost in agricultural exports already, because that's the primary thing we're shipping back from whatever we're getting from China. We're shipping back our ag goods. And so that's getting held up, and there's a big issue there. Fortunately, this is an area where I think you see Congress, despite party, putting America first, and you have a bipartisan solution. There was actually a standalone bill, which does not occur very often in Congress. Things are, in these giant 2,000-3,000 word bills. Everything's jammed in there. It's like a Christmas tree with everything hanging on it. Very few standalone bills get passed anymore in Congress. This was one of them, and it passed overwhelmingly 364 to 60 on December 8th. So just people putting America first, putting ag first, and the Senate has their own version of it. Hopefully that gets passed quickly. It actually has been stuffed in some other bills, the America Competes Act in the House and other things, in case those move quicker. So good news there. Other things going on. This just happened this past week, last 2 weeks. The USDA is funding for climate projects. And this is somewhat their pared back, the Biden administration's pared back attempts at addressing climate change through agriculture. That was a huge component of their policy platform coming into office. And if you remember, they talked about the carbon bank I wrote an article on that in the WEDA magazine, and their plans to basically use credit commodity corporation funds, which are somewhere around $40 billion. And if you'll remember, that's the same funding mechanism that Trump used to relieve farmers and use direct payments to producers who were affected by the sort of trade war that we had going on. So the Biden administration came in and said, well, we can use that same fund for our own purposes. And they wanted to use that as a carbon bank. That didn't quite go over so well. They were met with a lot of opposition. And so they've pared that back to $1 billion being allocated to the CCC, from the CCC, for partnership for this programs that they're calling Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. And if you're wondering what that is, the guidance they have are practices providing greenhouse gas emission benefits and carbon sequestration, so cover crops and the like, but there's really not a lot of great detail on this right now. And this is going to roll out pretty quickly. They're starting the grant process for proposals from 5 to 100 million in the next, I think in March or April. And then after that, the smaller projects will start rolling out the grant process as well. So this is what's happening. And I would say to that as well that, I was at a conference and I heard the Kentucky Ag Commissioner, Ryan Quarles, talk about this. And he said, he had a good point. He said, regardless of your opinion on the subject, ag needs to have a seat at the table, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I tend to agree with that. And so, if climate change is going to be addressed, it's going to be through ag. And there's even discussion about there may even be a new title in the Farm Bill that's dedicated to climate. Don't know about that. It's speculative at the moment, but there certainly needs to be a voice at the table on this. And then, of course, right to repair at the federal level. 3 bills, 2 in the House. One of the House bills is a broad-based bill, meaning it applies to all digital electronic devices. So everything from your iPhone to a tractor, to a coffee maker, to potentially, any digital equipment in a nuclear reactor. So broad-based, I don't think the authors of those realize that. Another one surprisingly addresses motor vehicles, which is strange because most right to repair legislation exempts motor vehicles because of their memorandum of understanding that's been in place for a long time. And then there's a Senate bill authored by John Tester from my home state of Montana. I'm gonna go up to the farm and have a talk with him about it. That is farm equipment specific in a lot of ways. And there's some reasons why I think he's introducing that bill, but I don't believe that it's going to go anywhere, especially, again, that going back to Congress doesn't have very many standalone bills anymore, and 2, we're in an election year, and 3, it's just not good policy. So not a fast mover on the fast track by any means. So that brings us to right to repair legislation. And I told you at the top, I wanted to start with somewhat of a look back. And really, the best way to do that is kind of in a graph, these maps with states, kind of a binary map of where states have introduced legislation in the past, and in the purples where a state has introduced it. This is going back to 2018. You could see that that's the first year it really started to explode. And then, you can see that it was really predominant in the Midwest and on the coast. And then after that, in 2019, you saw that it sort of, again, transferred to the coast. Some other states introduced it that hadn't before, but states that had introduced it, they looked at it, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, for instance, Iowa even, decided, well, we're not going to run that bill again. And it was, we thought we had it kind of licked at that point, or heading in the right direction anyway, as each state brought it up. And then it started to filter back into some states and leave some other states. And then by 2021, holy cow, we have an explosion of right to repair. It seemed like there was really a full court press to introduce it into as many states as possible, try to overwhelm opponents of it, and get a bill through. fortunately, there wasn't a single substantive bill that passed a legislature in all of these years. And that still remains even after cycling through nearly every state. When you look at this map, I mean, it's been everywhere. And these bills initially weren't specific to farm equipment. They were those broad-based bills. And, they slowly started to become more farm specific, and people started to sort of hone in on the issues they wanted to focus on, which takes us to this year. And legislation, the map, looks a little bit different. There's some states like Texas and Montana that are biennial legislatures, so they're not in session this year. But there's other states like Idaho where it wasn't introduced, or Oregon, some short sessions, usually for a lot of states that even numbered years are their budget years, and their shorter sessions, not focused as much on policy like a right to repair bill. But still, it's come back in some states and been introduced new in some other states. And even as of this presentation, I think right now, when we started this presentation, there was a hearing that kicked off in Georgia, last minute notice for, on the right to repair bill there. And there was a bill introduced in Connecticut today. So this is already outdated. But there were 39 bills introduced, to my count, or carried over from 2022 that were still alive. And that includes multiple bills in single states. So a state like Hawaii has, a gob of them, 5 or 6 bills. Some other states, the same. Massachusetts, they tend to introduce a bunch of the same bill repeatedly. But to this point, no substantive bill has passed the Chamber of Origin, knock on wood. And we've seen some more bills that are specific to farm equipment. And that continues to be the case in states like Missouri. And so what else is there to say? On right to repair, I guess we're still fighting the good fight. Oh, one of the interesting points for Washington State, they had a unique bill that was introduced that tried to create a labeling regime, this framework that would somehow force manufacturers to have a repairability score of 1 to 10 and slap it on every single digital device you could think of. That didn't go over so well. And that bill was eventually pared back to be a study, establishing a task force to study the right to repair issue. And that bill didn't even make it. And the crossover deadline has eclipsed in Washington, and that bill's dead. Actually, all 4 right to repair bills there are dead. We've had some really good discussions, though, about right to repair. And I think our messaging has become more sophisticated on this issue as we've gone along. And one of the things that we did, with this recurring issue, and my wife tells me that, she asked me the other day, is this your spotted owl? Which I come from a 4th generation logging family. And, that's about the worst curse you can put on somebody, is to tell them it's your spotted owl, because it basically means it's an issue that never goes away. It's been around for 30, 40 years and never goes away. I'm really hoping that's not the case with this. And I think, we're working towards changing the narrative somewhat. And to do that, our association launched an initiative, or we are launching an initiative fairly soon in conjunction with manufacturers on repair done right. And it's about how dealers are supporting customer repair. And so we did, to initiate this, we did a survey with farm equipment actually a couple months back. And we wanted to look at some of the key metrics, the key data points that really tell the story about how dealers and manufacturers, for that matter, are supporting customer repair. And so what we came up with was really interesting. And this has been used, we have infographics on this. We've used it in handouts with legislators and to great effect. But one of the key points was the percentage of parts sold out the door at a dealership. In other words, not installed by the dealer, they're installed by either an owner or an independent repair shop. And that number was surprising, it's 56%. And so for anyone saying, geez, equipment dealers or farm equipment manufacturers have a monopoly on repair and try to prevent, as the Biden executive order stated, trying to prevent owners of farm equipment from performing their own repairs. This statistic really refutes that. When you have a majority of parts sold out the door and not installed by the dealership, it's pretty hard to allege that there's a monopoly on repair. And when you go down the list and you say, well, who's buying that? Is it just owners or who? And so we wanted to ask the question too about independent repair shops. And what we found was the average dealership has 2 independent repair shops in their top 10 parts customers. And on average, a dealership will sell to 9 individual independent repair shops. And so it's not just the ag producer or the farmer producer that's buying that. Really, it's a lot of independent repair shops. And quite frankly, when we look at what an individual dealership stocks and parts, on average, it's over $1 million in parts inventory per location. And what that tells me, and what that tells the story, is that independent repair shops are piggybacking on the dealership for their business model. The reason they're able to charge lesser rates, obviously, they don't have the overhead of $1 million in parts inventory, let alone the buildings and the crane trucks and everything else that dealers do. And they also don't invest $100,000 on technician training per year. They don't continue that education to keep up with model changes in technology like dealerships do. And so one of the things I've pointed out to legislators is that they hear a lot about unintended consequences, which is always the boogeyman that nobody really explains what they are. And I've been able, through this, using this information, this data, I've been able to explain to legislators that, look, here's your unintended consequence. If you disincentivize dealers from stocking parts inventory and you offer it at dealer net cost or to anyone else outside the dealer chain, or you say that owners and independent repair shops can perform warranty work, what you're going to do is actually hurt the independent repair shop. Because if they can no longer buy parts from the dealership and they have to go and buy them from the manufacturer, then especially in this day and age with the supply chain issues, they may get that part in 6 weeks, a month, 2, 3 months, I don't know, depending on what it is. And that has nothing to do with the manufacturer holding that up. That's just the reality. That's what dealers have to wait on too in some instances. And that's why we have a parts inventory. Now, the independent repair shop has to wait that long. How long are they going to stay in business if they tell a customer, well, I can't get that part for 6 weeks or a month or 2? Not very long. And so that's a serious unintended consequence of right to repair legislation. So one thing we talk about then is we don't want to say there's not a problem in farm country with uptime, because we do support right to repair. But what is the issue? What's the actual issue? And I think what we've identified is that this statistic tells it all. The average dealership needs to hire 5 additional service technicians to meet customer demand. We're talking about a capacity problem, especially during critical harvest and planting times, peak periods. Dealers do not have enough personnel to serve all their customers. And even with independent repair shops, there's not enough personnel available to serve all their customers. And so you do have downtime, unfortunately, but it's not due to the availability or access to parts, tools, documentation, or even diagnostics. That really is not the problem. We're talking about capacity. And so we really focus with legislators on workforce development. What can we do to expand the number of technicians? And we've had some really good discussions, some real positive movement, I think, in that regard. That's a win for everybody, quite frankly, because those independent repair shops are usually former dealer employees. And so what are we doing as an industry to continue dealership technicians, investing in those guys? We invest 20 to 40 hours of training each year in them, but also another piece that's really critical is rural broadband. And that's because we oftentimes, or we do have the technology built into equipment to fix technology when it breaks, meaning we have remote diagnostic capabilities, but those rely on a digital infrastructure, rural broadband, and that's woefully inadequate. we all know about the digital divide in farm country. And what rural broadband does, though, and what I explain to legislators and policymakers, is that it takes that limited capacity we have in the dealership and it stretches it further, because you don't have technicians driving to the farm, and spending time on out in the field where they're not helping a customer. If it's something quick and easy, they can do it from the dealership. And believe me, they want to. Why? Because they don't have capacity and they want to serve as many customers as they can. So this year, a lot of times legislators, rural broadband has been around for so long, everybody knows it's been a problem. It just needed money. And this was kind of the year to do it. The infrastructure bill, like I said, is giving hundreds of millions of dollars to states to work on this problem. So we're getting a good reception as well when we talk about the need for rural broadband and how, combined with workforce development, that really takes care of this problem. Because we, as an industry, with our industry commitment and everything else, are already providing access to the things people need to do repair. And this is part of our Repair Done Right campaign. We're hopefully rolling this out to dealerships with training dealer personnel and providing some of the talking points to all personnel so they can have a discussion about right to repair and tell that good, positive story, that good narrative about what our industry is doing to support repair. So enough of that. Let's talk about something that we all really want to talk about, which is redistricting and midterm elections. Redistricting, this is kind of where we sit right now in the race to 435 in the House. There's 35 states that have finalized their redrawing of congressional maps. There's 6 states that are at large that aren't included in that. And so what are we seeing? What's kind of the trend here? Well, the Democrats are likely to flip 2 seats in 2022, which was not expected. They've been pretty aggressive and outperforming their expectations during this redistricting process, given their lack of numerical advantage in certain state legislatures and across the board. There's still some big states left that haven't finished their redistricting, which will be very telling. Those are Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina. Ohio and North Carolina haven't finished because they're actually in litigation. The courts have overturned them. And so they joined 12 other states that are currently litigating redistricting maps. And so the overall picture, I guess the takeaway here is you can see this map with where are the solid D, where's the solid red, and where's the competitive districts. And the highly competitive is that kind of gray or light blue in the middle there. You don't see much of that on this map. And that's the trend. That's the overall trend, is there's less competitive seats as each party entrenches their advantages. And so, there used to be about 13% of congressional districts were decided by a margin of less than 5 points. In this redistricting, that's going to be probably down to about 6%. There's just a lot less competitive seats that are up for grabs each cycle, and you can see where those are. There are a couple in Iowa, New Mexico, Southern Nevada. There's actually one additional district swinging onto the left coast in Oregon. There's one additional district that Oregon gained because of their population growth that is somewhat competitive. And then the remaining are kind of up in the Northeast, one down in Georgia, but just not a lot of them. And so, we're seeing the party still entrenched, and really the primary becomes the real election, as we all know, which takes us to the midterm elections. And I know it seems like might be preposterously early to discuss 2022 midterm elections. But if you're in Texas, that's certainly not the case, because they're the first in the nation primary is coming up March 1st. And so it's certainly top of mind for folks in Texas. And then as we start rolling into the primary season the rest of the year, it's going to kind of steal all our attention away again. So what are we looking at? Republican headwinds for House majority. That is certainly the story. Republicans needed a net gain of 5 seats to gain the majority. And there's some other things happening that are in their favor that, quite frankly, are out of their control. But there's 30 Democrats in the House that are going to be vacating their seats. There's, I think, 22 retirements, and the other 8 are running for other office. If there's one more Democrat retirement announced, that will tie, I think, or surpass an all-time record in the modern era since in the last 70 years. So I think a lot of Democrats are seeing the writing on the wall, and they don't want to stick around. So that's giving Republicans a huge advantage, because out of those, there's 38 competitive Democrat-held districts in those very limited competitive seats, and only 19 Republicans, Republican seats held in a competitive district. Again, districts that are decided by a margin of less than 5 points. And of course, we all know that Biden's approval rating is getting to somewhat abysmal numbers. 41% is the aggregation of all the polls right now. And a guy that I follow, Dave Wasserman, with Cook Political Report, I remember him saying back in December, when Biden's approval rating was still up around 47, 48, I think, somewhere in there. Maybe it was a little lower, but he gave Democrats a less than 10% chance of maintaining their majority. And as Biden's approval rating has fell, so do their chances. And so I think maybe they're hovering around less than 1% if you're betting. And they're also going against the headwind of historical trend for the party in power to lose seats. And so, some Republicans I know are talking about, oh man, we might get 50 seats, we might get 60, like they did in 2010 during the Tea Party movement. And I think the difference there is, in 2010, the Republicans needed 40 seats to just get the majority, and they ended up with quite a bit more, a historic election for them. Right now, it's looking like probably maybe somewhere around 30 seats Republicans might pick up. But interestingly, if they picked up 30 seats, they would end up with a larger majority than, because of where they're starting at, than they had in 2010. So that could really put a check on the Biden administration. And then when you look at the Senate, kind of an even battle there. There's 34 seats up for election. Of course, the Senate always has a third of the Senate up for election every 2 years. And out of those, there's only 9 unsafe seats. The rest are solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. And out of those 9 unsafe seats, there's really 7 that appear to be really competitive. And so that's New Hampshire, Nevada, Pennsylvania is probably going to be the most competitive. Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, you have Senator Warnock, who's running, who won the special election, has to run again. And then Arizona, same special election with Kelly, has to run again. And so you have 4 Democrats trying to defend their competitive seat, and only 3 Republicans trying to defend a seat. And that could change based on candidates. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies in Senate battles that can kind of buck the trend of the national. I mean, I think of Tester again in Montana. Trump won Montana by 20 points, and Tester got reelected in the same year. So it can happen. But generally speaking, it's favoring Republicans. Again, it's 50-50 there. So if this breaks either way, Republicans will probably gain a majority, and that looks likely. So that's, kind of wrapping up what I have. I think we have some time. I'm on schedule here. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. And Kim, has there been any questions?
Yes, did you?
Yeah, great.
Going back to kind of the beginning, when you were talking about, I think it was tax changes, were those proposed or enacted reductions?
Those are enacted.
Okay, that was just they wanted clarification.
Yep.
Then another question would be, how does the various class action right to repair related lawsuits that have been filed against Deere impact any of this legislation, or just kind of what we should be expecting to happen next?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's, you can believe in coincidences to a certain extent, but I think there is certainly a concerted effort, given the timing of those three pieces of litigation, and right at the beginning of session, and in conjunction with three right to repair bills introduced at the federal level. That kind of goes beyond the level of coincidence, in my opinion, and seems like it was meant to generate some media attention heading into state legislative session, and really put the spotlight on right to repair as an issue. And so I think they have an effect in that regard of drawing attention to the issue. But as far as I've read the lawsuits, but I'm not privy to the Deere's internal discussions about it. But looking at the face of the lawsuits themselves, they're somewhat ridiculous, meaning all they do is quote news media articles that are really not relevant and make it any more or less likely that there's some type of antitrust violation. But it doesn't seem to be affecting the conversations we're having at the state legislative level. I think when we talk about that infographic, the statistics, of our survey of the industry since our industry commitment, that seems to hold a lot more weight, and we're stopping bills. And I think people are starting to really get a sense of farm equipment being a lot different than other digital electronic devices, household consumer electronic devices, and the like.
All right, we might need some clarification from the asker on this next question, but it's how many other manufacturers are with Deere on right to repair? So the way I understand that are on the same side of the argument, I think.
Well, I think all of them are aligned on this topic. AEM, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, is they're the ones who represent all of the different manufacturers. They have an ag policy group. I think pretty much all ag manufacturers are main lines are a member, and AEM is in conjunction with the equipment dealer associations, developed the industry commitment that everyone agreed to. So, through their association, they are committed to this. And I think we're seeing that across the board, that manufacturers are realizing this and seeing it almost, as a competitive advantage. I mean, you go back to that 56% parts sold out the door. The flip side of that is there's 44% that's installed by the dealership, and every dealership's at maximum capacity. There's really not a sort of zero-sum thinking here about, well, geez, the more that an owner or independent repair shop does, the less business I'm going to have. Well, we already have more work than we know what to do with, and we can't meet that. And really what we should be focused on, I think some manufacturers, a lot of dealers are looking at, if they can basically just take care of their customer, whether that's them doing it and training them to do it, or doing it themselves, or an independent repair shop, they want to keep that customer up and running. And so I think some manufacturers are starting to look at that as a competitive advantage, the tools they have available, and how the ease of repair, and that's I think that's a good race to have.
All right, we do have some time for more questions. You can use the Q&A icon box to submit them. Are we vulnerable to legislation being passed in states that are not in the WEDA footprint? Are they giving it as much attention as WEDA is?
Yeah, well, I think we're vulnerable everywhere. legislation can always slip through, and states like Oklahoma, we didn't even get to testify on the bill, weren't allowed to. And so it varies on the state, but I think we're all in this together, regardless of the association. And I think the manufacturers have stepped up to a great deal to address this as well. And, as an industry, this is our issue as an industry, regardless of a regional association. So I think everybody's doing their best to address it.
This is sort of outside of the legislative topic, but from what you can tell, does it seem like more people are buying foreign equipment versus U.S. built equipment?
I
have no insight on that.
I don't either. I'd say, Kim, you probably know better than I do. No, I don't. I have no idea about that.
Okay. Going back to the question about Deere and the other manufacturers, I think my opinion is, Deere's been sort of put in the spotlight as the brand that the general population is most aware of. We're most aware of Apple also, and that's the brand that the general American is going to recognize, but certainly is impacting everyone equally.
Yeah, and I would say that, they have become a poster child for it because of the brand recognition. You're right, but at the same time, it's a good thing because Deere is also, I think, to be fair, leading the way in this regard with availability of diagnostics and through their service advisor and through their apps that they have. I'm not trying to plug Deere here, but I'm just saying that they've risen to the challenge and done a really good job of addressing it. And I think in some ways, this right to repair discussion, we've been doing a lot of it for a long time, but I think we're getting better, and it's made us better. So I think our industry as a whole has risen to the occasion, which is a good thing to see.
And in that regard, anything dealers who maybe haven't gotten involved in any sort of the lobbying efforts on right to repair legislation, what they, how they can get started and involved in it if it's something they want to do?
Yeah, that's the best way that we defeat legislation or support legislation is through the voice of the dealer. There can be 100 of me and it wouldn't be as valuable as one dealer call from a constituent of a legislator. I'm the hired gun, but your voice and dealer's voice is the one that matters. And that's the one voice they want to hear. And so that has been the success of our efforts, our advocacy efforts across the board is getting dealers involved and engaged. And that's made the world of difference for us to kill these bills, to educate legislators. We've had dealer demonstrations. I didn't talk about those, but we've had dealer demonstrations across the country. I think we're well above 30 now, and also in Canada. And that's the best way. Get a legislator, invite them out to your dealership. I know it can be scary. You don't have to do it when there's a bill, but get your local legislator to come down and talk to them about what you got available and walk them through the dealership so that they're aware of who you are, what you mean to the community, the jobs you provide, and create that relationship, because politics is very relational and all politics is still local.
Do you know what the right to repair landscape looks like in Canada?
I do, yes. And we've had dealer demonstrations in Ontario and in Saskatchewan and Alberta. One recently in Alberta that my counterpart Larry Hertz, who's vice president of WEDA for Canada, he put that on. Was very successful in putting that on, and so there's a bill, a member's bill in Manitoba that has been introduced and that is specific to farm equipment. And then there is a member's bill or was a member's bill in Ontario that related to more related to cell phones, iPhones, and smartphones, household consumer electronics more than farm equipment. And then there is another corresponding issue that I think, again, Larry Hertz, and credit to Larry Hertz and John Schmeiser, our CEO of WEDA, for their effort in this, which is really splitting a hair, but it's a distinction with a big difference. And that is interoperability versus right to repair. And interoperability is just the, every people on this call, dealers know that's the name given to, the issue of linking up a honeybee header with a John Deere combine or something. And so it's the interoperability of different implements with different lines of farm equipment. And that's different than right to repair. Sometimes they get lumped together. In fact, in the federal bill in the US, they're lumped together, but they're separate and distinct. And those two guys have done a great job with the federal government in Canada, making that distinction and advocating for dealers in federal law, specifically copyright law, to allow that interoperability, but without sounding like we're supporting right to repair. It's a very tight rope to walk, but they've done it well. And so that's kind of the landscape where we've met. I spoke at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture meeting a couple of years ago. Have had meetings with Keystone Ag Producers in Manitoba, and we're actually planning a dealer demonstration there when it's allowable in Manitoba for that bill sponsor there. And so we're really, we are addressing it just as much as we are in the US. We have kind of a very good game plan in place up there.
Okay, quick, just a comment to everyone. One of the dealers who's attending has just wanted to share that he's had a very positive experience in educating legislators in their state by requesting face-to-face meetings. So just some encouragement there. And then another question, will there be materials and briefing for dealers on repair done right, so that they can have an informed view on why customers should have their service done by an authorized dealer?
Yes. Yep. That will be part of it. And I mean, we still want to support the dealer. We want to make it known that there's things available, but obviously the first stop should be the dealer. And I think most dealers have a number of stories about people that went elsewhere and made the problem worse and had to come back into the dealership eventually to get it fixed. So we all know that, but we certainly, the dealer should be your first choice. And in that Repair Done Right campaign, great point. Absolutely, we want to support the dealership and have you guys retain as much business as possible.
All right, well, that is all for the questions that have come in. Just a reminder to everyone again that we were recording today's session. So if you want to go back and review it, we should have that available likely tomorrow, but just keep an eye on your email and the Farm Equipment newsletter for more information on when that's available. On behalf of Eric and the WEDA team and the Farm Equipment staff, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. There'll be a short survey that pops up afterwards. Let us know what you thought of the event and if there's any topics you want us to cover in the future. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everyone.